Hi, and thanks for joining us for another installment of Women at Iowa. I'm your host for today, Erin Tiesman. My guest today is Sue Buckley, Vice President of Human Resources at the University of Iowa. Her 35 years on our campus includes past director of the Women's Resource and Action Center, active member of the Women Against Racism Committee, and co-founder of the Iowa Women's Foundation. She was the first recipient of the Jean Jew Award. Without further ado, welcome my guest, Sue Buckley. Now let's start at the beginning. Thanks for joining us today. Okay. I understand you were born in New York and got your bachelor's degree in New York, and you received your master's from Purdue. What brought you to Iowa City?
Right. Well, most people always assume it was because of the University of Iowa, and actually it was not. In between getting my master's and then my idea of then getting my PhD, and I was already enrolled at the University of Toronto and had various assistantships, fellowships, and was ready to go. During that interim, the summer of 1974, I decided to hitchhike around the country, which really meant for a New Yorker of the West. And I think I was in search for a utopia or something close to it. But anyway, I didn't find that. But on the way back, myself and my pal who I was doing this trip with, we stopped in Iowa City, and I never left.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. You served as various roles in the UI campus. Starting in 1974, the the Women's Resource and Action Center kind of started really coming about. It had been there before as the Women's Center. Can you talk a little bit about your involvement and kind of coming to the doorstep of the Women's Center?
Well, when I first got to Iowa City, which again was the summer of 1974, I decided I wanted to seek out the Women's Center. I had heard about it, and at that time it was called the Women's Center. It was at 3 East Market Street. It was a little white frame house, long ago gone, but there it was. And so I did, and found the house, and was going up the front door, and at the same time another woman was entering the house, and that was Mary Coogan, who was actually walking into the Women's Center on the first day of her employment. She was the first actual paid coordinator. So it was somewhat coincidental if you take a long view back, but Mary and I walked through that front door simultaneously. It was another year before I joined the University of Iowa. When I got to Iowa City, it was a time when the idea of women in the skilled trades was very much in the air, and so I went up to Kirkwood Community College and entered their welding program and became a certified welder. Not surprisingly, I was the only female in the class. And then I went to work for a large manufacturing plant in Cedar Rapids. No longer exists, but it was called Link Belt Speeder. It manufactured cranes and excavators and some other heavy equipment. Anyway, I was on the second shift, and again, I was the only woman on the floor, and learned some important lessons. One, that if I wanted to have all my limbs intact and survive, I probably should seek other employment, although I enjoyed welding.
No, I understand you were very instrumental in the creation of the pre-vocational program for women that ran from 1989 to 1999. Right. Can you tell me a little bit about that creation?
Well, in a way, you have to go back to my days at the Women's Center. And towards the end of my time there, say maybe in the last 2 years, or maybe the last 3, I started to get very focused and interested in the issue of women and employment. And at the time, our president was President James Friedman. And because of another organization I was involved with, which no longer exists, but it was in a sense an association of women on campus, I had it arranged that President Friedman would do a forum about the status of women and people of color on this campus. And it was held down in EPB. And so we had the forum, people came, and I had prepared well. I came with a lot of statistics and numbers about the lack of women in the workforce, in particular in the skilled trade force at the University of Iowa. Now, James Friedman was quite an intellectual, and I'm not so sure he knew exactly what I was talking about in terms of talking about the workers in the physical plant and whatever. But my predecessor's predecessor, Mary Jo Small, was in the audience, and she immediately did what a good administrator does. She stood up, sort of went to his rescue and said, sort of across the crowd towards me, said, Sue, well, let's convene a committee and look into that. That's always a very good answer. Let's study it. And I said yes, and it took over a year to get this committee together.
Oh, wow.
But finally, we did get a committee together, and it had actually the right people. I mean, it had individuals from the various physical plants at the university. It was called that then. I mean, now we say facilities management, but then it was the physical plant. Hospital, resident services, the general. Various administrators, some trade workers. And we really started to talk about, again, this really dramatic lack of presence of women in these types of occupations. We were wandering around in the desert, I think, some, but at that point, it became clear we had a great resource and we needed to bring her to campus to sort of stir things up. So Dale McCormick, who later went on to be a state senator in Maine and the treasurer of Maine and so forth, but at that time was a very successful contractor. She had been the first woman in the United States to successfully go through an apprenticeship program in carpentry, and she did it in Iowa City. She was a good friend of mine, and it still is to this day, and had written a number of books about carpentry, and again, had a strong business, but she was running a training program in the state of Maine for low-income women to help them transition into occupations where they could be economically self-sufficient. So we brought Dale in, and through conversations with Dale, I started to think, well, although it's never been done, and I don't mean just at the University of Iowa, I mean at any university or four-year college, but given we're almost, in a sense, a city unto itself, why not use like the skilled trade shops and the skilled trade workers in developing a program like this that would really open the door for low-income women in eastern Iowa, so to help them transition into, again, jobs where they could be economically self-sufficient, whether that be skilled trades, technical, and so forth. Now, of course, there was no money for something like this. I mean, it was pure service to the women in this state of Iowa. And but at the time, I also met Mary Weiberg, who then worked in the Iowa Department of Education. And she had a number of responsibilities, but including overseeing what was called the Carl Perkins federal money that came in to states. And then there was like a pass-through and then allocated out in grants, including sex equity grants, displaced homemaker grants, single-parent grants. And anyway, Mary and I, again, so in a way, coincidentally, at that same time, we got to know each other. She was very fond of the University of Iowa. And although at that time state government thought this type of funding should never flow to a Regents institution, because it was really about vocational education. Anyway, make a long story short, we were successful in getting some of that initial funding, and then through a lot of partnerships with area unions, human service agencies, community colleges, and a lot of folks within the university community, we ended up creating this training program for women. It ran for over a decade. We did a lot of direct service to women to help them, again, move into better paying jobs. But then there ended up being other parts to it in terms of like providing technical assistance to all the community colleges in Iowa, and eventually became a federal demonstration project in terms of unusual partnerships and, again, how to help low-income women. So long story, but it started back in the days in the Women's Center. A lot of things started back in the Women's Center.
Definitely. What else can you tell me about your time with the Women's Center? I understand the Women Against Racism Committee also came from that group of women as well.
Yeah,
and that
absolutely.
was something that was very dear to your heart.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm always quick to say that it was the most important group I've ever been affiliated with, and I think that will stay true no matter how long I live. The Women Against Racism Committee had an early start with people like Linda McGuire, Rusty Barcelo, and a few others, and then it went dormant a little bit. But then I became director in '83, and there was some new interest in sort of resurrecting the Women Against Racism Committee. Now this, now this might sound like an easy thing. Mm-hmm. Then it was not. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But there was a group of women who came together, some affiliated with the Women's Center, but many who were not, and in fact some who weren't even affiliated with the university, but came together. And for a solid decade, we did, I think, just truly incredible work in terms of, one, living what we were sort of studying and talking about. I mean, we were, in a sense, our own self-contained laboratory in trying to become really real allies mm-hmm. with each other. Mm-hmm. And the method was what we called, this thing called personal work, but it was really sort of unraveling, unpacking your own experiences so you could understand, in a way, the oppression of others and your own internalized impression that really gets terribly in the way mm-hmm. in terms of connecting to people who are different from yourself over important identities. Mm-hmm. So in one way, it was this group that we met a lot, and we read a lot, and we would have these long day sessions, but we do that. But we also then sort of took the show on the road, mm-hmm. and we did more of these workshops that I could ever count. I mean, through Iowa, through the Midwest, mm-hmm. and actually through the entire United States. And these workshops were incredibly powerful because it was trying to demonstrate to people you can unlearn, in particular, racism, and also other oppressions. But and first you have to understand how you learned it, mm-hmm. Which is sort of the underlying message of why you can unlearn it. This was very hard work. But I know for all of us, my guess is we each think it was probably the most important experience and the most important lessons we've ever learned about actually connecting with other people mm-hmm. and what it takes. That it is so much more powerful to personally connect in the way that we did than to read books about oppression, think mm-hmm. about history. I mean, those are important pieces, mm-hmm. but it was this personal work between each other. And again, sometimes it was brutal, mm-hmm. but it was very inspiring mm-hmm. all the time.
What has it been like to see, a lot of people see Iowa City now as a very diverse mm-hmm. community. What has it been like to see that transition from those early stages in kind of that identity?
Well, in some ways it's hopeful, in some ways it's ironic, in some ways it's not true. I think Iowa City, University of Iowa, is more diverse than it was then. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we overstate how diverse we are, and we have a lot of work, a lot of ground to cover. It's also, and when I said ironic, in some ways it's very interesting that back then, starting around 1983, I mean, we were using the concept diversity and that word, diversity, inclusion, and so forth. And no one knew what we were even talking about. Now, today, that seems mm-hmm. like, okay, that's just part of how we speak, mm-hmm, diversity mm-hmm. and inclusion, diversity and whatever. Then, much different. And another marker, I think, of change is then in the Women's Center, we often got challenged about, you're a women's center. Why are you paying so much attention to the issue of racism? And a lot of people would ask us and found it somewhat incredulous. I mean, mm-hmm. like, you're a women's center. You should be, I don't know, focus on the ERA 100% or something mm-hmm, like mm-hmm. that. And I mean, again, we were clear that to be a women's center, to be inclusive, of course you had to focus on racism mm-hmm. and other forms of oppression. Mm-hmm. If not, you were really leaving out many women, and denying these really important identities that we all carry. So that's been a change too. And I would also say that, University of Iowa, say, we're a diverse community, but we were never more diverse than in 1989. We did a 4-day national conference. This was the Women Against Racism Committee. And 1,500 people attended it for the 4 days. And people came from Europe, all around the country, United Airlines. I always remember that they added more planes to bring people. I mean,
that's incredible.
And we took over the union. I don't mean like we took it over with a sit-in. We rented the union for 4 days. But it became this truly diverse community for 4 days. And I've never seen Iowa City or the University of Iowa since ever sort of look like those 4 days. So
you had mentioned, you've talked before in essays about kind of this identity struggle that the Women's Resource and Action Center went through, and not that it was an identity struggle so much, but that there was kind of this, you kind of always had to explain yourself, and like you just mentioned, kind of explain what your mission was.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Now, there were times, it's a great question, because there were times we wanted to explain ourselves. For example, why we were addressing the issue of racism, and why it was so core to who we were about. But there were other times we were having to explain ourselves in defense. And that was particularly true, I would say, from about maybe around 1982, 1986. It was about a 4 or 5 year period there where it's really not an understatement to say the Women's Center was under siege. There were some conservative, or I might say extremely conservative groups that, for whatever reason, targeted the Women's Center and would contact the governor's office, legislators, Board of Regents, would get on radio, particularly out of Des Moines, and in a sense like do what in their minds I think was like exposés of the Women's Center is undermining like family values, practicing witchcraft, recruiting young girls to be lesbians. I mean, they had it all out there. And some of it, in retrospect, can even sound comical, or it's like, well, who would buy that? But in fact, it created a lot of problems for the Women's Center because we had to spend a great deal of our time defending it, trying to dissolve it, and not for it to get into the way for us to do the work that we wanted to do. Probably one of the best responses I remember that the Women's Center had. And there were many, and many of them creative, I might add. And some I can't even tell in this interview. But right when I got the job at the Women's Center, this was in the spring of 1983, and I was to start on April 1st. Well, actually, I guess it was a few days before, at the end of March. And again, there was I believe it was the student group that was bringing in Phyllis Schlafly, a very prominent national, extremely right-wing individual, spokesperson, head of the Eagle Forum, to Iowa City. Well, that was all fine and good, but then the request came in to have a news conference for Phyllis Schlafly in the Women's Center in the middle of the day in the back room. Now, I was just starting the job, so I inherited this, and she was coming on the 4th day of my new job.
Oh, my goodness.
And so at first, it was like the rational approach, saying that, that we would say, and this is with the Women's Center Advisory Board, well, this doesn't make sense. I mean, we never have people do news conferences in the center in the middle of the day. There are all these offices in the back room. People are working. And at the time, Philip Jones, who was in student services, as was the Women's Center, he was saying, oh, no, you got to do it. And we'd argue back and forth, Phil and I, and Phil Jones was just adamant. We had to have this news conference. There was no way out. The Women's Center, it's a university building. It's going to happen. And it was hard to swallow, the idea that this ultra-right-wing person who was at that time, such a visible anti-feminist would have this news conference. So I decided, okay, I would meet with Phil Jones and his boss, Philip Hubbard, who I actually reported to, with Vice President Hubbard, terrific individual at the University of Iowa. And we sat down to talk about the situation, and again, Phil Jones kept repeating that I had to do this, at which point Phil Hubbard looked at me, and I had known Phil from years before. My first 4 years at the university, when I was the coordinator of the Action Studies program, I worked for Phil Hubbard, so we knew each other. And he sort of got this little glint in his eye and this little sly smile, and I knew something good was going to be coming. And Phil Hubbard said, well, if there were too many reporters, we would have to move the news conference. So at that point, I knew I didn't need to get clarification because I was just given the gift. So I left. I said, and left the meeting and put out the call. And so then the morning that Phyllis Schlafly comes to campus, it was a big to-do. And a representative from University Relations came to the Women's Center, was on the front porch, and the reporters started to arrive. And by the time we were done, it was somewhere around 86 reporters had appeared because, reporters from the New Pioneer Co-op newsletter and Emma Goldman, I mean, they were all, everybody was legitimate, but again, we had put out the call, obviously, for reporters. And everybody came with their credentials. And so went into the back room. Meanwhile, the back room had shrunk, and it would make, again, the story shorter. The news conference was, in fact, moved over to the old Gold Room in the Iowa Memorial Union, where these news conferences should take place anyway. But what also happened in this moment was what was called Ladies Against Women, which was really a national guerrilla theater group, pretty much trailed Phyllis Schlafly wherever she went. And it was, and they would send a community, sort of a do-it-yourself guerrilla theater kit if they knew Schlafly was coming to your town. So quite a large group of women decided that they would do guerrilla theater that day and become Ladies Against Women, which essentially meant that this group of women dressed in very conservative sort of 50s outfits and took on the role of being happily oppressed. So, for example, in the news conference, they would ask various questions, or there was this large demonstration actually on Madison Street between the Women's Center and the Union with Ladies Against Women carrying signs such as "Born to Iron" or 59 cents is too much, whatever. But it was actually great fun. And we all lived through it, and we went on from there. But I mean, that's an example of a challenge that had a happy ending. Sometimes it wasn't so happy.
I understand there was some, in 1984 there was some vandalism that occurred, and you had faced there was an incident with some T-shirts in the Memorial Union that had been displayed, and it was very discriminatory.
Well, again, there were different incidences that occurred along the way, and one time we had a brick come through the window. Another time there was a small pipe bomb by Halsey Gym, and sometimes there was graffiti, on the front of the house and so forth. But again, never underestimate the creativity of feminists to manage a situation, or, okay, how can we achieve our goal even if we have to take 4 right turns and 3 left turns and go in a circle? We'll still get there. And certainly during that era, that was true. So
it was a very interesting 6 years with your women, with the room. What has it been like to see the changes in the campus and the the Resource and Action Center is still thriving.
It is, and I think the fundamental success of the Women's Center is that it's been able to sort of recraft itself and really meet women where they are, and young women who are our freshmen and our sophomores, and sort of change what it's doing and continue to be relevant. Because one thing a Women's Center cannot do is be the same thing and think it's going to work. It was just, it was different in the 80s, and then say even in the 90s, and certainly today. I mean, back then, there was a lot of activism. Some of it, just totally traditional stuff, where the Bijou would be bringing in films. We didn't like them. We viewed them as racist, sexist, whatever, and there would be, again, these demonstrations. I mean, there was one night where they were doing a midnight showing, and I forget if the movie was Dressed to Kill or Peeping Tom, but it was some a film about women and violence, or violence being directed towards women, I should say. But I remember that everybody would always meet at the Women's Center, and men and women alike dress up as all in black, white face, and we just lined all the halls in the Iowa Memorial Union going to the Bijou, basically with signs saying, please don't go to this movie. And we were all silent. So again, very traditional. Sometimes it would be a little more creative. I know there are times flyers would appear that said certain films were canceled, whether they were not or whether they were, that's a different point. But there was that. But then there was some very serious, I think, efforts in trying to get the university community to be more responsive to the needs of women. And first started with the issue of comparable worth, which was a long, long journey for the Women's Center and the Council on the Status of Women. The two organizations often worked very closely together to ensure that that women were being paid comparable wages for comparable work here at the University of Iowa. Again, that was it was long, took over 2 years to get the study done. I mean, the commitment to get the study done, and then the study actually being done. But that emboldened people, and so from that, then there were efforts related to childcare, sexual harassment. We did a lot of work in the area of affirmative action, but probably nothing during that era was more powerful than the Jean Jew case in terms of a specific issue.
Which was extremely, I mean, now they have the award, the Jean Jew Award, which you were awarded the first time. But can you tell us a little bit about that case? It was a very important sexual harassment case on our campus and changed a lot of what we see today.
Well, it did, and in a way, it was our Anita Hill case. I mean, the facts of the case are completely different, but in terms of what it did in terms of people's minds, Jean Jew, for those who don't know, is a Chinese-American faculty member in the Department of Anatomy and Cell Biology. Jean came to the University of Iowa, terrific scholar, fabulous teacher, solid researcher, and had tenure. But then was not granted being a full professor. And she had experienced for quite a few years, really, you can only describe it as unspeakable racism and sexism. And it was both. I mean, it was a great example how, multiple identities, and you can experience things both because of your race and because of your gender. And Jean Jew is truly the definition in my mind of like true grit. I mean, she is a woman who will not be denied. And what I mean by that is that her sense of what is right is so strong and unshakable that she was able to do what most people could never do. And that was endure a legal battle for over a decade, really just to get the right to be heard. I mean, so that the facts of her case could really be in a public court of law. And her endurance and her commitment to sort of the integrity of the workplace, that people should absolutely have the right to work, or in many cases study, free of harassment, was an inspiration. But originally it was an inspiration for a very small group. Universities, big place, people are very involved in their various projects, and a lot of things can go on that are important that not a lot of people know about. But initially with Jean, the Women's Center, and especially the Council on the Status of Women, people like Dolores Nesbitt or Ellen Haywood, Martha Chamalis, Ursula Delworth. There were a lot of people who, in a sense, were like a support group for Jean. Because first she had to deal with the Iowa legislature to get even the right to bring her case forward. Then there was a university panel that was appointed by the administration, a faculty panel, to hear, in a sense, her grievance. The panel found in favor of Jean, and then the panel's findings were disregarded. And then Jean went to state court. It was a defamation hearing, and she won in state court. And then finally, there was the federal trial. And it was in front of a well-respected, relatively conservative judge, Judge Vietor. And this was in the fall of 1989. And so it was heard, and then the ruling came out in 1990. And to our actual collective delight, but also to our shock, she won. And but then, and that was again in the summer of '90. That fall, when school started, I think those of us who were close to this case thought, okay, finally the right thing happened. She won in federal court, and the university will acknowledge that it was a hostile environment and things needed to change. And at that moment, the Attorney General's office, the Board of Regents, university administration, chose to appeal the ruling. And it was, it was in a sense a collective devastation that happened. And when I think over the 35 years, it was probably the low point, at least for me, in terms of the university. I think the university is a fabulous place. It's wonderful. But institutions are complex, and they're highs and lows. And I would say this was the lowest moment, was that moment. So at that point, a larger group started to surround Jean, and it was called the Jean Jew Justice Committee, and had a lot of faculty, staff, and we weren't quite sure how to have the leverage to basically what we thought was like, let's all come to our senses, and do the right thing here. And then there was a moment where Marjorie Wolf, who was then the chair of Women's Studies, and I, sort of simultaneously, we had an idea, which was to take the opinion of Judge Vietor, which was 26 pages of very lucid prose, because he just outlined what had happened to Jean and why it could not stand. And we took that 26 pages. A lot of people threw in a lot of money, because this is before computers and easy dissemination. And overnight, got it printed, and then the next morning we divided it all up, and we got the opinion into every faculty's mailbox on this campus. And it was the reading of that opinion that sort of, it was the tipping point for people at the University of Iowa. They read it. They didn't know Jean. They didn't have to know Jean. But when they read this judge's description of how the university had behaved through these other representatives, they wouldn't let it stand. And the sort of the outrage over this just mushroomed and led to a lot of pressure, and then ultimately the appeal was withdrawn. But so again, it had a good ending, though I have to say, I'm forever indebted for Jean for what she did. I think all women on this campus should be. But I think we should also never lose sight that although Jean won all these court cases, that somebody who does this never stops paying.
Another thing that, and this is a little change of pace, but you had mentioned to me prior to our interview about your work with athletics, which has come a very long way, long way, women's athletics particularly. You worked there with them for about 4 years, is that correct?
That's
Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
Sure. Well, it was... well, this is another point of mushrooming and a sort of explosion. It was at the moment of Title IX. So when I first joined women's athletics, and I had 4 years at Action Studies, and the next 4 was at women's athletics before I then became the director of the Women's Center. But when I joined women's athletics, it was still located in Halsey Gym. There was no Christine Grant field hockey field. Well, actually, there were virtually no facilities at all. And the job that I had was dealing with the setup for competitions and facilities and so forth. And so, our idea of a field hockey game against another school would be the field outside the Union, which is let me tell you, it's a horrible field for field hockey. I mean, it's not a competitive grade field, even on the best day. Or say the softball team sometimes would play intercollegiate games out at Mercer Park. If that wasn't available, well, we'd throw some lines down, again, on that same field.
Oh my goodness.
Instead of, right today, there's an actual softball complex, but none of that existed. And virtually every day in my job, I would go down to the physical plant. Again, that's what it was called at the time, and particularly deal with the folks in campus shops and having to sort of beg, borrow everything, whether it was a truck, a piece of equipment, paint striper, whatever. And everybody was pretty good-natured about it, but it was like 4 years of hazing. Because you always got the worst equipment, the things that were broken, the truck that hadn't been used for 2 years, a lot of times for fun. But it was hard because the women's athletics at that time really was growing at an incredible pace. And, so in a way it was growing pains. But obviously today it's much different. So
it's had an incredible blossoming experience. You've been so part of so many different things, and activism on the campus and helping make these changes. And now you're in an administrative role. So what kind of transition was that for you, and what kind of transition is it for you now? You had mentioned before that now you're in this role that it's a broader reach. Yeah. It's even broader.
Yeah, it is broader. That's a wonderful question, and we're going to get there. But okay. I do want to talk about just a couple of things more from the past before we get to the future, because it was more in my mind, given you had me back in women's athletics. Well, actually, I'm going to even do another detour because, again, for women's athletics, trying to gain that legitimacy, credibility that, it just wasn't automatically there. It had to be worked for and earned. I always remember when we always had a great field hockey team. That's been a strong tradition here at Iowa. And, we'd play these god-awful games on that field by the Union. And then finally, there was this moment where we got permission to play some field hockey games in Kinnick Stadium. Now, of course, it would be an empty Kinnick Stadium, but it was in Kinnick Stadium, and it was AstroTurf. And that seemed like such an advance, But the problem was, it was AstroTurf, and we weren't permitted to put any lines down. But a field hockey field is completely different than a football field. In terms of the lines and striking circles and so forth. So what we'd have to do is use, in a sense, floor tape to mark out an entire field and all the lines and circles and whatever. But AstroTurf holds a lot of dew and frost, and field hockey gets played in the fall. So, I mean, it's amusing, but it's a little painful too. I mean, thinking about this, because we would just go through anything to make this work. I mean, even getting that tape to stay there long enough for a game, because it was so important to get beyond the crummy grass field at the Union. I mean, to have a proper playing surface for an intercollegiate game. But anyway, there was a lot of that during the time. But another direction I wanted to go to was, because again, I was thinking of important moments at the university, and certainly the Jean Jew case is one, and when we did the 1989 Women Against Racism Conference. But if asked, personally, what has been the most important moment for me in all these years, to me, it has always been one answer, and it will always be this answer. And it was in 1985, when after having worked on this for a couple years with administrators in Jessup Hall, and especially Mary Jo Small, again, my predecessor's predecessor, that the University of Iowa human rights statement was finally expanded to include protection for gays, lesbians, and bisexuals. And at the time, because we sort of started working on this in 1983, and again, it took about 2 years to, and that's quick in university time. I think you know that. Because we can always talk about domestic partner insurance, which really took 13 years from start to finish. But but on this, what was so poignant, and it was the thing about being seen and being visible. Again, being credible as a person. I mean, to be named in a human rights statement. And I was in my office at the Women's Center, and it was a Friday evening, and again, and I had gone around to a lot of different groups, and I had done a lot of work to try and make this happen, along with Dwayne Rehovitt, who was a practicing attorney in the community. And that night, we were having an event in Shambach down at the library that was drawing a big gay lesbian crowd, and I had pretty much framed it to the university administration that we really needed to know. I mean, was this finally going to happen or not? And we were having this event, and everybody was expecting an answer. I mean, it was a little bit of smoke and mirrors, but sort of framing it. And we had just come off of the Phyllis Schlafly and the Bijou. I mean, there had been a lot of activism, so I think my alluding to there was going to be a lot more was taken somewhat seriously. But it was probably like 4:45, 10:05, and I got a call, and it was Julia Mears, who was then serving as the general counsel for the university, and she said, "It's done." And it was the most important moment, the whole ride.
Incredible, incredible journey to get there.
Yeah.
So now looking back,
right,
seeing those changes, how do you feel now, and being that 35 years,
well,
quite a span.
Well, in terms of seeing the changes, there are always a lot of lessons, and one of the lessons is when you're early out of the box, sometimes the changes are a little weird. So that being a great example, that although what happened was protection for gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, the phrasing of it initially was affectional and associational preference. Now, I was like, what does that mean? But I mean, it meant actually sexual orientation and who you hang out with. But at the time, we were so early in schools doing this, and there was such sort of pressure around it. There was like, okay, let's not be so out there. I mean, let's use maybe language that's not as explosive or something like that. And the same thing is very true with domestic partner insurance. Matter of fact, even more so. I mean, that was a 13-year odyssey. And when we started to offer domestic partner insurance here at the University of Iowa, we were the first university and four-year college in the entire country to do it. There only was one private school in California that was offering it before us.
That's incredible.
So I didn't particularly think there was risk to it, but a lot of other people did. I mean, who were decision makers and up in high places. And so to get sort of one's foot in the door into what we agreed to it initially, and my partners in this, Claire Olson and then Pat Kane later on, but we agreed that originally domestic partner insurance would be restricted to only one health plan, was what was called then CHIP 2, and the original benefit was that partners could have access to health benefits, but the university wasn't contributing anything. So open the door to access, but we're not actually going to give money, extra money, in the same way we do if you have a spouse. And, you could say, okay, well, that's not right. Well, it wasn't right. Not very sort of pure. No, it wasn't. But it was the first step that invariably was going to lead to all of it. And I think that has been often my lesson in political work, particularly at the university, is that first steps are okay. Part is often okay because you build on it, and eventually, and hopefully, it'll become what you originally had hoped for. I mean, this is outside the university, but a quick other example, even more graphic, was in the late 70s in Iowa City, trying to get, then I was working with some other folks, getting the human rights ordinance in Iowa City broadened. And the city council was divided, and there was a counselor named George Strait. He was the swing vote. And one day, Claire Olson, often my partner in these things, we went, it was a Saturday, and I remember being in George's kitchen. He's smoking these big cigars, and it was like cutting the deal. And George was clear. He would vote for it, but only on one condition, is that housing would be excluded. So protection would be extended, again, for gays and lesbians and bisexuals based on employment, public accommodations, credit, but not housing. And again, you could be self-righteous and say, well, I'm not going to, we're not going to be involved in this because, well, for the obvious. I mean, it's like, why would you exclude housing? Well, in part it's because it was, it still is the industry of Iowa City. But we said, okay. And, all right, it took a few more years to get housing in there, but we did. So it is one of the lessons along the way.
Definitely. Right. It's been an amazing experience for you,
yeah.
obviously.
But you were starting to ask me about more current time.
Just right. About your transition from activism to administration and kind of where you find yourself now.
Well, there's probably more overlap than people have any idea. It's just, it takes, it just has a different look. Let me be clear, and for the record, I wanted to be in administration. And in some ways I can explain it in that it's who I am. I like large institutions, I like complexities, I like systems, I like thinking about structure and process and change and so forth. And what better than the University of Iowa? I mean, it's a very complex organization. Now, before I became part of central administration, it's true, I spent a lot of time sort of on the margin, sort of, friendly throwing rocks and, trying to get the institution to change, whether that had to do with sexual harassment, affirmative action, and a whole host of other things. But I have to say, there came a point where I wanted the opportunity to do good work with all my effort versus having to use, 75% of my effort and having to always explain and legitimize what I was doing, whether this is the pre-vote program, the Women's Center, Women Against Racism, whatever, that because so much of my time was trying to get other people to, okay, this is credible, this is important. It was like, can't I just use my time and talent to do good work? I mean, that's clearly a desire of privilege. I mean, but still, I in a way, it's like I wanted to come in from, orbiting the sun being Pluto and like can I come closer? Maybe Jupiter or some Mars. So anyway, this is to say I wanted to be more central, and but it was with it comes a lot of challenges, because you can't, to function effectively, say in the job that I'm in now, you can't quite be as out there and in a sense a political activist in the same manner that I was 25 years ago. On the other hand, the stage is much, much bigger. I have many more opportunities to influence for the good, for the better, and to help ensure that people are treated well, with respect. And I'm not saying I'm successful all the time or even most of the time, but I do know I have, again, a great platform to try to do good work. But it is not as showy or, again, as sort of out there as maybe some of the other activities. And although I'm very much at peace with that, and I really love what I do now, I know when I first sort of transitioned into central administration, a number of people who had known me already for quite a few years, one hand they say, "Oh, that's great," and then the other they would say, "And are you selling out? Or have you already sold out?" Or just wondering. And it was, it was sort of, I found it odd, and sometimes I found it even frustrating, but understandable too, because I had to act in some different ways, and particularly in terms of behavior. And there are a lot of things I do influence. It's not appropriate for me to be public about it. It's just not, and I won't. So anyway, for me, it's been a great transition. I love this institution. I have been so fortunate. All the opportunities I have been able to be part of all along the way.
Well, it's been a lovely experience, and I appreciate you sharing your story with us.
Yeah.
We're running out of time,
okay.
But thank you so much for sharing everything with us. Your span on this campus has been very influential, so we thank you for joining us today, and thank you for tuning in again to Women at Iowa, and we'll see you next time.